Hello and a warm welcome to Straight from the Heart, a podcast by Pragyan Advisory. I am Sunil Ganesh, your host. Over the last several months, we have realized the importance of having conversations, deep, focused conversations, and taking a leaf out of this entire piece, we have termed this series Conversations. In every conversation episode, we bring in a person of repute in the space of this industry as a thought leader or a senior leader, and we try and understand from them the space that they are working in and what have been their significant takeaways over the last very many months. In today's conversation, we have a very special guest. He is the chief executive of BIOS International, which at its core focuses on something which is very exciting, which I personally liked a lot, is giving organizations the confidence in wise decision making in uncertain times. Very interesting. He also sits on the British Standard Institute's National Standing Committee on Artificial Intelligence and is currently working on ISO recommendations on board governance and AI. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He's in attendance at all party parliamentary group on AI. He is a member of the APPG on Human Health and Longevity and a senior fellow at the Cambridge University Resilience and Sustainable Development Program. Dear listeners, it's my pleasure to welcome Robbie Stamp. Robbie, welcome to Conversations.
So Neil, thank you very much for having me as a guest, sister, and I'm really looking forward to this.
No, it is a pleasure for us as well. And in fact, the theme that we've also picked up for our conversation with you today is this sweet spot that you also very passionately talk about, AI, ethics, and its implications on leadership in general. So let's start with this British Standard Institute, the National Standing Committee on Artificial Intelligence. Help us understand, what is this committee doing and what is its relevance at this point in time?
Well, the British Standards Institute National Standing Committee on AI, which is part of the ISO umbrella. So that global standards body, ISO, the various national governments have their own national contribution. And of course, ISO does standards on everything. And I'm just happened to be one involved on the one on AI. So I joined that a couple of years ago. And the document that I've particularly been contributing to is the document looking at board governance and AI. And when I started that, my first meeting in Paris was quite interesting because I went in the days when you could, I traveled and there was a meeting and it really brought out my inner drafting geek, I think, because I like wrestling over the choice of words. And the old hands there said, look, either people come to this and love it or they kind of come and never go again. And there's one terrific question in relation to AI, relevant for leadership, really at all levels in an organization, but this was aimed at boards. Does the governance of AI systems feel different from the governance of traditional IT systems? And if it does, why does it? Does the governance of AI systems feel different from the governance of traditional IT systems? And if it does, why? And that's a really good starting question, which boards need to be asking themselves. And I think it's a really powerful, my answer is yes, it does significantly. And we can talk about more why I think that if you'd like.
No, in fact, it'll be very interesting to know because this is a very, very pertinent question that you put in. So demystify this for us.
Well, I think that in terms of demystifying it, the AI debate can get quite cloudy and misty. So you have groups of people sort of at one end of the scale who go, oh, it's not intelligent, it's dumb, it's stupid, it's only maths fitted to curves. And at the other end, you have it's going to be more intelligent than us. One day it will know everything that human beings have ever known, this thing called the singularity moment. And I'm interested in those, but I'm more interested in another question, which I think in a way is deeply relevant for a board, which is simply to ask, what's the work that any AI system is doing? Just ask that question. What's the work it's doing? And how critically does it sit in relationship to people in your organization. You can think about it in those traditional contexts of accountabilities and authorities in an organization. And let's dive in quickly on something which can stand, I think, as a thought experiment for why it matters. So let's take people who would say, and a lot of people disagree with me about this, but my position is, if you say AI systems are just a tool, it's just a tool. Now, if you imagine an alien coming to the planet, always good start for a thought experiment, and you use the same word tool to describe a hammer with which you hit a nail into a wall, and a global algorithmic trading system trading trillions of dollars in nanoseconds through the year, I'm not sure you've told me anything very useful about either the hammer or the AI system if you're using the same word. One thing waits to be picked up and used as you bang a nail into the wall. The other acts without human intervention. So it doesn't come back, the global algorithmic trading system, and say, Sunil, shall I buy this share? Shall I sell this share? It goes ahead and does it. Now, it's been designed by humans. It operates within systems created by humans. But I think you have, in governance terms, to acknowledge that it has a form of agency. You don't break the meaning of the word by saying that it has a form of agency. It gathers data in the way humans do. It analyzes, processes that data. Humans analyze and process data from all kinds in the most broad definition of data: sight, sound, smell, molecules, etc. All of the things that our brains are doing all the time. And then critically, there is not a human in the loop where it goes, buy that, sell that. So if you're a board, ask yourself those questions. What's the work that the AI system is doing? And that's just a very different way of not getting stuck into the, it's intelligent, it's not intelligent, it will one day repurpose our atoms to build, silicon bridges into the stars for its own purposes. I'm fascinated in all that. But for a practical point of view, if I'm a board member or a chief executive, and these systems are deployed in my organization, that's my question. What's the work it's doing, and how does it sit in relationship to the people in my organization, my purposes, my strategy, my tactics, my ethics?
Interesting. And why is that question assuming significance? Because you put it very, very eloquently. What is the work being done? How does it sit in with the people, the processes? Why this? Why now?
Well, again, it's a great question. Without going into all the reasons why we've got this current AI explosion to do with, compute power, all the different new techniques that have been, designed, created around neural nets and things. We'll leave that to one side for another kind of podcast. I think that it's because there are clearly things that it does. I'm going to use the word cognitively that at least resemble the way in which humans act. So I think one helpful way of thinking about it, for me anyway, is a Venn diagram. So I think that there's humans and there's AI and data. And there are things that this system, the AI and data systems, are capable of doing at speeds which very few, if any, human beings can do already now, today. And there are things which I believe forever will be the preserve of embodied chemical substrate, 3.2 billion year evolved human beings. But there's clearly an overlap. And in that overlap, you can ask. So let's take a very practical example. I look at 5 key relationships. So the first question I ask in an AI system is the work the AI system doing fundamentally advisory? So does it come up with a recommendation, see a pattern, make this loan, don't make this loan, insure this person, don't insure this person, invite this person for interview, don't invite this person for a job interview? Does it then come back and say, Sunil, that's my recommendation, but mate, it's up to you what you want to do with that. I.e., there is space for human judgment, discretion, decision making. So that advisory, and there's a whole range of issues around the quality of the advice. Is it biased? all of the quality of the data sets, the cleanliness of the data, all of those issues. But it seems to me to be a useful boundary. So if I'm a board member, I could ask, are the AI systems that we deploy fundamentally advisory? That's a useful question, which you could then drill down. The next question I think that's interesting is, does the AI system implicitly or explicitly wield any authority? So let's do a quick thought experiment. And this actually would matter to a board member because this is to do with regulation and legislation. Suppose you and I are working in an HR team, and our job has been to sift through CVs, curriculum vitae, resumes sent in by people looking for jobs. And we report to a boss. And you and I do that work, and we read through the CV, and we say to our boss, invite these people in for an interview. And the boss, that's what happens. You and I we do the work, we invite the people in for interview, and we report to a boss. Have we got a form of delegated authority? And we would say, yes, we've been delegated an authority to make those decisions. Now, if an AI system, and there are those out there, is doing precisely the same work, it reads CVs, it says, invite that person, don't invite that person. You have got a form of delegated authority. And from a governance perspective, not to describe it as thus is to start to lose sight, from a governance perspective, of the nature of the relationship you now have with the AI system. So is it explicitly or implicitly wielding any authority? Have you delegated authority to it? Is it starting to assume a form of authority? Because in fact, people just take its advice all the time. So actually, in fact, they just take its advice all the time, which would lead me to another critical thought, which is about abdication. So what starts to happen is, let's imagine a very, very obvious example, the design of driverless cars. If you design a driverless car on an assumption that in a moment of road crisis, the AI system on board hands back to you, the driver, after 500 hours of problem-free being in a driverless car, the idea that you as a human will have your hands on the wheel with your attention primed in the way that we should now if we're driving, though we were joking the other day, I would never dare drive in Delhi. But if you have hands primed on the wheel, it's a nonsense. You will be watching Netflix. And so you have, as a human, we've got to see, well, when do we cross that abdication boundary? We think we've left the space for our decision making, but our judgment is atrophying, our skills are atrophying. Let's take some bright young lawyers at a top law firm. And they are acting for a company that's buying a great big huge company with a complex supply chain, a set of complex supply chain contracts. We put 5 bright young lawyers into a room for a week, feed them on coffee and pizza, and and then they emerge bleary-eyed and blinking a week later and go, right, we've looked at 60 contracts, here are the weaknesses, here we think of the risks, there's a financial risk, there's a reputational risk. Now, if you've got an AI system which can scan those contracts and look for those anomalies in a contract and do it in 5 minutes, then how do those young lawyers get to be experienced, wise, judgment-making human beings? What do we abdicate and when to AI is a very good question. And are people in your organization increasingly abdicating? It is classically, the computer says yes, the computer says no. And you don't think, actually, I do think we should lend money to this person. I do think that my judgment is that we should. But the machine has got the authority, or I don't care anymore, and I just stop exercising any judgment at all. And I'm just now effectively, I'm a biological carrier out of instruction from the AI. So advisory work, the nature of authorities, then abdication. The next one is agency, and that was the one I was talking about with global algorithmic trading systems. You'll hear very often in AI circles people talking about the human in the loop. The big question is which loop and when. Now, you're in probably the human is in the design loop, i.e. we're designing the system, we're purchasing the system, we're scoping and specifying a system. There are humans in the loop at that stage. But in so many places, the human in the loop has long since bolted. Let's look at what happened with Facebook's algorithms. They started to, as we all know, learn to maximize certain kinds of outrage and behavior. And they didn't come back each time to say, shall I promote this tweet, this post? They just went ahead and did it. They went ahead and did it. They didn't say, Sunil, I'm going to promote these 100 posts. I'm going to demote these. They went ahead and did it. So again, my point would be that is a form of agency. Now, philosophically, we could say that agency has to come with intent. Can an AI have intent? But I do think you can, at least as a thought experiment. So again, as a board member or a chief executive, I'd want to know, well, what forms of agency does any AI system on the work that it is doing on my behalf? What is it? How risky is it? What are the checks and balances around it? How are we tracking whether what it does meets our purposes, meets our values, meets our ethics? And the last key thing is accountability. And I think I would never, ever write AI accountability. I would only ever write accountability for AI. And I think this is an absolutely fundamental issue for boards who have that ultimate accountability in an organization, that because you can't sanction an AI, it doesn't feel pain, shame, guilt, remorse. You can't send it into a corner and ask it to think about what it just did. You certainly can't send it to prison. All of those things are meaningless. But all human societies of whatever scale and size have had ways, whatever their normative behaviors, whatever they decide are the rules they abide by, have ways of being able to punish transgression. You can banish somebody from a tribe, for example, and that's really dangerous because you've not got your kith and your kin to look after you. You can't banish an AI; it doesn't mean anything, and therefore our systems of accountability are fundamentally based on human emotions and the capacity to sanction. I mean literally from pain of death through to, let's give a good example of a driver. So supposing I get in a car having had one glass of wine too many, nothing egregious, but I kill a child. Now, I'll be caught, I hope. I will be tried and I will be sent to prison and I will serve time, probably not the whole of my life, but I will serve a decent chunk of time. I will have been punished. But there's another punishment, which may be for the rest of my life. I have the same nightmare every night of that moment where my car hit the little girl and I see the look of horror on her mother's face, and it torments me for the rest of my life. I'm racked with guilt. Now, no driverless car system will ever feel that. And this is a critical issue around accountability. So no boards should ever get confused about where accountability sits. It sits absolutely squarely with them. So if it's at work in your organization and you are accountable and possibly liable, you'd better be pretty clear about the nature of the work and the working relationships in your system of accountabilities and authorities.
Wow, no, this has been quite enlightening. I think the 5 pieces that you spoke of: advisory, authority, abdication, agency, and accountability. I think in many ways is deep. So how is this standing committee, if I may choose to put it this way, going to enable the boards in this journey?
Well, I think what it does is it gives some boards, my honest view is it's long. It will be read by some board members. I think I would want to, in a way, I think if I was talking to boards and going and having a conversation about this with them, I would use something simpler like the 5 A's, because I think you can, those 5 A's that we just discussed, because you can use it as a way of asking as a non-technical person. You can be a lawyer, you can be a finance person, you don't have to be technical to ask those questions and get answers which you'll be able to understand. So I think the work on the ISO paper, I think in essence is get you to think about, as a chief executive and as a C-suite, as a board, as key stakeholders, that great question: is it different? Is the governance of the AI system different? And if it is, why is it? And I'm suggesting some of the ways in which I think it is different and why it's different, because a traditional CRM system wouldn't traditionally have been able to gather data and then act on its own without a human in the loop. And that relationship space, what it means for our biological selves to have a relationship with data and AI. So the question I ask a lot of the time is, how is AI manifest in the world in any given relationship in a local context? And I think for boards, it's critical to go below the bigger abstractions of let it do no harm, let it be fair, let it not reinforce bias. We hopefully, nobody set, or very few people set out for the systems they buy, deploy, design, implement to do those things. The really hard yards are in understanding the local context, the local potential for harms, and of course the huge opportunities that AI provides as well. So I think this is a general governance question, which after years of thinking about governance, I think is quite a good 3 questions to ask, where a board should be consistently asking, and let's keep it within the AI system, though in fact these are good questions anyway: how's that working for us? So it implies, well, what's that? What is that is working? What are our definitions of working? How we're tracking that? How's that working for us? The second question is, who do we mean by us in this context? And I think this is a very profound one, because if you look at the way in which so many boards have thought for a long time, and indeed organizations, their us has been a very narrow us. I mean, if we get really philosophical about it, the narrow us of, it's just, in a UK context, white middle-aged men is the us, white privileged middle-aged men who get always to turn left on the aeroplane. And if you'd asked groups of them for decades, how's that working for us? They may have said, fantastic, it's going great. But if you'd asked different forms of marginalized groups, if you'd asked rivers, trees, systems, how's that working for us, you might have got a very different answer. So I think one day somebody will write a good book called The Narrow Us. So how's that working for us? And who do you mean by us? The third question is, of whom are you asking those first 2 questions? So how wide are you casting as a board your willingness to, if you like, borrow a phrase from philosophy here, and phenomenology, your sensory motors? How active are you as a board in going and feeling and sensing what is going on in your organization as it responds to its internal and external challenges? So who are you asking? Are you as a board just seeing the papers that the executive are feeding you? How do you, and particularly if you're a non-executive director, the whole theater of the board, the rocking up at these meetings, the big board papers, the sitting around the table, the ritual, the rigmarole of boards, I think there's a revolution coming about what boards are going to need to do to be far more adept at looking at all sorts of data, not just numbers, not just finances, not just the things that they've traditionally looked at each other and gone, how's that working? That's fine. There's a much wider set of questions. And of course, to put one refinement on how's that working for us, who do we mean by us, who are you asking? You've now got AI to go, who or what are you asking? So are there patterns that sophisticated AI systems may be beginning to track and see for the board that will be useful in answering those first 2 questions?
Interesting. In fact, Robbie, the way you describe this, and correct me if I am reading it right, what I'm hearing from you is the boards will now have the if I may say, the additional challenge of making meaning out of things that may traditionally not have been part of their lingo or their worldview.
I think
What
it's a
I'm
very,
hearing from,
very succinct. Absolutely right.
right? So, and therefore that itself could be one big shift for the boards as well, to be mindful of what all is happening around, of whom are we asking, that casting the net wide, and making meaning out of all those aspects. So that will be a significant shift for the board members as well.
It would. I mean, I think it'll be huge. I mean, boards who are stuck in compliance and regulation work. So, they're doing effectively has that been done? Compliance. Well, I mean, slightly cheekily, frankly, if that's all you're doing, you could be replaced by an AI. If all you're sitting there doing is, did that get done? Did that get done? Did that get done? Well, that maybe you do have an AI board member whose job is compliance and does just say, yeah, that got done, that got done, that got done. The meaning making, particularly with ESG agendas. I mean, I think that, we have seen, welcome truly to a world of uncertainty over the last 2 years. And the ESG agendas for boards, Me Too agendas, Black Lives Matters agendas, the technology agendas. I mean, in some ways, who would be an NED? Who would be a non-executive director on a board now? Because I think if you've been used to looking and thinking about one particular kind of relatively narrow context, and suddenly now you're as a company, you're expected to have almost like a mini foreign policy. You're being torn apart by the big shifts in geopolitics. Are you with China or are you with America? Are you going to have to choose? You're not going to have to choose. You're a country like India, absolutely fascinating geopolitical position to be in for the rest of this century, as these huge tectonic plates, probably 500 odd years of human history since the late 15th century, in terms of the West's relationship with the rest of the world, are fundamentally on the move. And that has profound implications. So I think that what boards need is they need people on them who are always able to put their particular specialism, whatever that was, as they merged into people, the kind of people who would be in boards, into a much wider context, into being willing to scan horizons for early systems, early signals, early warning signals, to have those wider conversations and not always return and huddle together for warmth around a particular expertise or a particular piece of compliance. And it's going to get difficult. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And the certainly in some of the UK environment, the regulatory requirements around boards are getting stricter and stricter. But at the same time, as the environment they operate in is getting wilder and wilder. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on boards in general. And AI could be massively helpful for that. I mean, it could be enormously helpful for starting to detect patterns, second, third, fourth order consequence of decisions. And I think boards need to be much more imaginative about the way they game through and imagine decision making and play out issues, how they use data, how they use 3D data, visual data. The board meeting of the middle of this century will be very different from the way in which board meetings currently look, where people shift around with a paper and a couple of PowerPoints. It's going to look very different.
Okay, that's interesting. So give us a feel. Maybe I don't want you to do a crystal ball gazing, but how would it be different?
Well, I think one of the things, okay, well, here's a thought experiment. Supposing one of the things that the board is doing, let's put it 20 years ahead, and maybe it'll be quicker than that. They're looking, their CFO is doing her report to the board about, financial plans for the next year. And the board is not looking at a PowerPoint on a screen. They've all got some form of 3D glasses on, smart ones by now. And they are therefore sitting in a 3D space. The data space of their organization is represented. And if it's boring, it might be pie charts and bar graphs. But if it's exciting, it might be fields and trees and rivers and streams. So the CFO, she's holding in her hand an object, so it's a square, which is costs. And she can feel the costs in her hand. It's got a bit of weight. And she squeezes it and says, this is a 2% reduction. And a bunch of things happen around the board, and everybody goes, oh, okay, well, that we see that drop here, that cost saving there. And they go, oh, that looks good. Yeah, we like that. And then a non-executive director says, well, what about 5%? And she goes, okay. And so she does a squeeze and a 5% squeeze. And they go, oh, we like that even more. So, we've got those job losses here. We're going to save that cost. We're going to divest ourselves of that. That looks good. And somebody says 7. So she does another squeeze. And then suddenly there's a huge crash behind the boards. And everyone turns around. What did we just break? What just happened? Because something happened. The system detected a 3rd, 4th order effect that they hadn't seen. And they're now immersed in the data space. They're navigating the data side of their organization, and costs and numbers and customer interactions and all of those things are objects which we can touch and we can move and we can do far more. What if, I wonder what if we did do this, and literally we'll feel weight in our hands. So it will look completely different. If I was a really far thinking board right now, I would be working with people who are experts in uncertainty and complexity, thinking about that. I'd be finding a brilliant game designer who's brilliant at creating 3D worlds, a couple of mathematicians, and probably an anthropologist or two. And I would be having the most interesting skunk works to create the future of the board, to be much, much, much better able to respond and make sense of the complex adaptive systems which they need to be able to discern much more fully.
Wow. Well, you almost gave us a feel of how it might look like, but I was just trying to imagine how would it look like. But yeah, that's an interesting space. I hope that happens sooner than later.
Yeah, so do I. I'd love to be involved. I'd love to get stuck into this. Is exactly the kind of skunk works project I'd love to be involved in.
Great. So that brings me to the second one, which I know again has been a topic of immense interest to you, and therefore I'd like to also get your perspective on this, which is this entire piece of AI ethics. And if I were to add another dimension to it, is therefore the leadership that typically in organizations would be dealing with it. So help us understand, what is this intersection of AI and ethics? What does it look like? And your view of the implications on leadership around this.
And obviously the AI ethics field has sort of grown massively over the last 4 or 5 years. And again, in a way, it stems from that why, and it's because of those kind of questions we've been exploring this morning already, or my morning already. And that is because we can see AI systems being manifest in different ways in the world. They act in relationship to us in ways that some previous technologies, in fact, I would argue most previous technologies haven't. So we suddenly think, oh my goodness, we need AI ethics. Now, it is an interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, can an AI system be ethical? Can it act ethically? And is there a distinction there? Because all ethical systems, back to the question we were making earlier about accountability and pain, all ethical systems, whatever they are, whatever size the society, has human embodiment and feeling at their hearts. They've been created by us meaning-making human creatures. As we work out how we work in relationship with self, with Atman, with the sense of self, with the other, and of course, in a lot of First Nations thinking, how you act in relationship to a much wider range of trees, plants, rivers, your own stewardship responsibilities. And there is a very long strand of Western thought. It's not the only strand, which starts there, in verse 28, chapter 1 of the Bible, where God says to Adam, subdue the world, have dominion over it. It's yours. You've got all fish and fowl. It's yours. But that isn't the way that huge swathes of First Nations people all over the world have ever thought about their human place in the world, what it means to be in relationship with the more than human. So I think that there's a deep need to hold a paradox, which is to celebrate human beings at their constructive best, to recognize the need to mitigate us at our destructive worst, and at the same time get over ourselves, celebrate ourselves and get over ourselves at the same time. Find a bit more humility about where we sit. And I registered a domain name in lockdown, which was Homo Humilis, which is the thought that if these generations of humans can act with a little bit more humility about where we sit in the great big scheme of things and the huge creativity that would unlock, we would one day in future be dubbed not Homo Deus, Homo Humilis, because it was the humility we found and the creativity that unleashed for different kinds of more inclusive solutions. So it's in that context that one could start to think about what might an ethical deployment of AI look like. And again, I think that sometimes there's an engineering mindset which goes, right, well, now what are our ethics going to be? Now, of course, we as humans, we've been at this for thousands of years, and whose ethics, which traditions, a Western tradition, Indian traditions, Chinese traditions, Confucianism, Mohism, Buddhism, First Peoples. As soon as you start listing them, you go, well, actually, the idea that we're going to one day go, that's it, we've got our ethics. So I think the truly ethical way to behave for leaders, if they're going to keep with AI, if you are going to deploy, purchase a system, you have intent, it's going to do something, that it should be something which you are not setting out to be biased, to racially profile people who shouldn't be being racially profiled, all of those issues. But the next really important bit is to watch like a hawk how it's working in practice. So not to do I think it's a story that's gone round and round the AI community, but the AI system that was determining parole and then discovered far too late that it was actually one that was routinely discriminating against young Black men. And it took a long time for that to be discovered. Let's take an even more dangerous example. I was reading something, well, not even more, another dangerous example. I was reading recently about a young woman with endometriosis who'd gone into a hospital where many hospitals and pharmacies in, I think, just about every state in the US now, this was an article in Wired magazine, deploy an algorithm which is a private company that they bought the algorithm from to determine the likelihood of somebody being an opioid addict. And what happened is that the woman went in severe pain. She was put on a drip. And then 2 days later, something changed and she was basically sent home, still in pain. What had happened is the algorithm had said, we think this person already is or is in risk of being an opioid addict. And one of the key parts of data, as she subsequently discovered, that the algorithm had found, which changed the behavior of the doctors, was pet medication, because she rescued very sick pets. And the medication she was buying for her pets was showing up on her own medical record and was tipping the balance of the algorithm into thinking this person is an opioid addict. Do not be the hospital, the system that deploys that kind of algorithm without the appropriate checks and balances. That's ethical behavior. So don't get overhung up on top level abstractions. You can do that work. And there are tons of ethical frameworks and things that you can look at out there. I would ask these much more practical questions. What's the work? You have an intent with it. Let's assume your intent isn't evil. What are you then doing to make sure that it is deploying in the right way? So is it delivering on your consequences? Are you reviewing it appropriately? Is it doing the work you wanted it to do? What do the people around it think about the work that it's doing? Is it doing, is it exercising its judgment in a way they would go, yeah, that's what I would do most of the time? Or is it not? If somebody feels that it really isn't, who do they talk to? Do they know who's got the accountability for the system? Will they be listened to? Will they be able to raise concerns? Will they be, put back in their box? Imagine an algorithm which is detecting which matches prisoners up. It's a real algorithm. Who's going to share which cells? So imagine a new prisoner, and she's being brought into a prison. An experienced warder takes her to meet her new cellmate. And in the 60 seconds, 2 minutes of introduction, something tells the experienced warder this doesn't feel right. Something, she may not admit, something doesn't feel right. But this is what the algorithm's recommended. And since they've recommended the algorithm, violence has decreased in the prison by 30%. So good stuff. But this doesn't feel right. What happens next? Can she go back to the governor and say, Gov, this doesn't feel right to me? And the governor go, Mary, it's you, get her out now. Does the governor say, thank you, Mary? Well, send a note out. Keep everybody posted. Make sure that the next shift knows. Does the governor go, Mary, I need more than a feel. Look at these numbers. Look at the numbers. They're great. So I need more than your sense. Or maybe worst of all, does Mary not say anything at all? Because she doesn't trust her judgment. She can't articulate it. She can't articulate what it was. So she doesn't say anything. And the next morning she comes in and some poor young prisoner has been beaten up. Now, what I would want to be doing if I was a board or anybody, I would want to be all over these issues. I would want to know what my review mechanisms were for understanding what happens when AI becomes part of a complex adaptive system. What happens in those messy interstices, relationships, what happens? That's what I would want to have line of sight on. That, I think, is the deepest way in that local context in which you can behave ethically.
Beautiful, beautiful. In fact, if I were to interpret this in my own words, what I'm hearing from you, Robbie, is, I think it goes back to those couple of words that you used, that in whatever shape and form we go ahead with AI, there have to be distinct red lines drawn, that it is not something that is going to usurp the so-called judgment making or decision making of individuals. There could be certain things that fall within its purview, but clarity has to exist that what is it that is not getting abdicated. I think that's something that as leaders we may always need to be very, very mindful of, because the way you are articulating this example, what was crossing my mind is, and it was more like, it's like the situation of a pendulum, that I suddenly find AI as a panacea for all the troubles that I'm going through, and I let go of the pendulum from one end. But it will never stop at the middle, it will go the other end. And there is a time it will take for me to realize, oh, it is doing even damage on certain other aspects, while it is doing good on certain other aspects, and I need to rein it in. So from a leader standpoint, it will also be very important for us to know what those guardrails are, what is out, and therefore what are those judgments that may have to remain with me as a leader. But most importantly, am I able to pick it up on a consistent basis that here are the cases where deviations are happening? And I think that's where all these aspects of keeping an oversight on, keeping an eye on this, looking into whether this is doing what it's supposed to do, assume so much of significance. That's going to be a very different set of work for leaders to do. Because in the traditional system, it's easy to call somebody and ask what you did, what you didn't do. But here is a system, and the other thing which I really like the way you articulated is that there is an implicit trust in a technology-based system, right? If it says this is good, I don't think very many people will apply their mind over it. The system is recommending, so go ahead with it.
Well, that was my point earlier about abdication, really, is that exactly that. And maybe it'll be right 99 times out of 100, but maybe there's the rare edge case, and maybe that rare edge case is reputationally or financially extremely dangerous. And I think, AI has got enormous potential. I mean, you look at what AlphaFold have been doing with 3D protein folding, drug discovery, medicines, energy efficiency. There are algorithms that seem to be, you can find an algorithm which does things like detect breakdowns in windmills, in wind farms, and identify when there's going to be a breakdown before it happens, saving millions and millions of pounds. And those algorithms can then be deployed, weedless Starkland, in other industrial contexts. There's a huge it's going to be, if we harness it right, a way of starting to see and be in our world, which will be of enormous benefit. But like all things, it's going to be a struggle between us that are constructive and are destructive. And it's neither the utopia, the panacea, nor is it all horrible. That's just human nature. You know, we will be these creatures who struggle with these issues. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about it in relation to power, because here's another thing that I would do ethically. I would examine, when I deploy this system, what are the power relationships that sit around it? Am I increasing inequalities? Am I simply reinforcing the power of a certain group of people? And if you think about theories of power very, very, very crudely, very broadly, we use the word power in two ways. We use the power to do something. I have the power to do something, and I have power over. I can make you do something that you don't want to do. I've got the capacity physically to force you because I'm your boss. Different forms of power: utilitarian power, coercive power, the power of ideas. And I think that there's an underexplored area here that I'm actually working with the IEEE on a paper on the concentration of technology and power. I think power and power relationships are so far a relatively underexplored space when we look at AI, relatively.
So maybe it's a bit early, but what would be your suggestion or guidance to leaders as to how should they prepare for some of these situations that they will be dealing with in the coming years? AI, ethics. How does one equip oneself?
Well, my answer would have to be read. Just make the time. You know, read more than an op-ed in the paper. You know, I mean, it sounds, but set up a half a day or a day with some experts who can come in and scope what's going on, scope the issues. Don't make them all technical. Don't have it all be a day about the different kinds of techniques. Ask for the non-technical board member the kinds of questions that I've been asking, which anybody can ask. Okay, says a non-technical board member, we're deploying this. What does it do? What's its work? What's its outputs? Who's responsible for it? What work did we do to understand what the potential harms were? What work are we doing to understand whether those harms are emerging? Who has that accountability? What kind of line of sight can I have over it? That's the work I would be doing, and I would push through the thought that it's just another piece of IT, or the dystopian, it's going to eat us for breakfast, the Terminator, and just say, no, there's a much more profound set of questions that you need to answer as a board if you were deploying one of these systems. And if all it does is it's a recommendation engine, and you understand that, it's recommending what films you might like. But even there, supposing, as does happen, that the algorithm noticed that, a young person was, visiting various kinds of eating disorder sites, and then it started to recommend them, TV programs like the suicide, 10 ways to kill yourself. Well, maybe then actually, it wouldn't be so, we wouldn't think it was so harmless. My recommendation engines on Amazon for my books are very good, because it knows what I like, and it actually makes good recommendations. So I take an enormous pleasure, by and large, in taking a screenshot of those and sending the screenshot to my local bookseller and asking her to get them for me. so I like to support my local bookseller. But these are the issues that I would be spending time to ask those kinds of questions. And it's why that protocol, is it advisory? What form of agency does it have? What authority? Who's got authority over it? Have we found that we've suddenly delegated this authority to the people we ask for job interviews? What is its facial recognition technology? If it's using facial recognition technology, ask a question, for example, of if it's your HR team that's deployed it. In a UK context, this would matter, and I don't know enough about Indian legislation. what does the algorithm do if somebody's had a stroke and the muscles in the right hand side of their face aren't working properly? Let's assume, if you ask the HR director, okay, so what are in this facial recognition technology which invites people for interview, what's it looking for? Is it looking in a 15-minute interview for 60% of eye contact in any given contact? What are its parameters? So if somebody has had a stroke and they can't look because their eyes are, what do you do? And if you haven't thought that through, you've just opened your board to a class action lawsuit, because it's illegal to discriminate on the basis of a disability in the UK. You can't do it. So, board, you allowed an HR team to deploy a system which you didn't understand at all, which they didn't really understand, which has now opened you up to significant reputational risk. Don't be that board.
So ignorance is no longer bliss.
No, well, that's another interest. Willful ignorance. Their lawyers telling them you're better off not knowing, all of that stuff. I think that's going to get less and less and less tenable.
Interesting. So I think this has been very, very useful, Robbie. And this brings me to the last segment, and this is something that I ask all our guests who come on to this conversations. Last 18-20 months, as you would have seen, pandemic, some would call it a classical black swan event. Not that many of us were prepared for how to deal with it, etc. And as you have been speaking with organizations, clients, senior leaders across, what have been your 2 or 3 biggest observations around leadership during this 18-20 months? What caught your attention?
Well, one of the first things would be I would question whether it was a black swan event, because you look at lots of people were meant, pandemics were part of national strategy planning. It wasn't like nobody had ever thought of the possibility of a pandemic. Hey, we've had Hollywood movies about it. So I'm not sure whether it qualifies for that classic black swan event. And I think that, in a way, maybe refers to a theme which has been quite consistent in our conversation today, which is how do leaders do this very tiring work of consistently scanning the horizon, looking for those small signals, sometimes those quite large signals. How do you increase your capacity to be aware of what's going on around you and not just stay in your lane and think, well, this stuff doesn't affect me, this stuff doesn't affect me. I'm just here to make the numbers. That's it. It's my job. And all over the world, we're seeing, again, it's overcrude, but that Milton Friedman free pass, which said your only responsibility as a board is to make a profit and pay your taxes. Now, when you look at the complexity of the systems that we operate in now, and what has happened as successive generations of companies have externalized the environmental damage costs and a whole range of other social costs, which, they were making their profits, but society was, they privatized the profit and socialized the risk. And then when the real risks come on, who steps up? It's taxpayers. It's not, the taxpayers. So I think that leadership has always been tough. It's going to get a lot tougher. And you can either be the leader who kind of thinks it's all going to go back to the way it was. Don't worry, we've had these before. We'll go back. It'll all be okay. There will always be an orderly queue of customers at 9 a.m. in the morning. Or you're the leader who goes, well, no, maybe it really isn't. There is a combination of climate change, these technology, these big shifts in geopolitics, which are moving us into a very unstable period. So how do you be a leader? Well, I think one of the first things is you've got to take the duty of care to yourself very seriously. How do you look after yourself? If you've got this big duty of care for lots of people, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, what do you do to look after yourself? Because you cast a big shadow, and what are you doing to care for yourself? How do you do that? What is it? And it could be anything. I mean, you know, it could be keeping budgerigars. It could be, you know, just absolutely carving out the time to do some reading. It could be walking. It could be running. It could be swimming. It could be a sport. It could be chess. It could be, you know, whatever it is. But what's your duty of care to yourself? I think then the next thing I would suggest is that I think we, in so many circles, have fetishized leadership. I think we still have this great big idea of the hero leader, who comes and, you know, in a very primitive way, they think it themselves. And they also, you know, people want them to be the hero leader, make all this uncertainty go away. And somebody comes and, you know, the classic CEO who comes in and needs to sort of show who's now in charge and just upsets everything that's gone on in the organization before, just because they feel that that's the way they should be, as opposed to going and listening. What was working? What wasn't? What do I understand? You know, we do a lot of thinking at BIOS about capability when we think about the future and the way people think into time horizons. What about your willingness to look into the past, to think about the things that have led the organization to be where it is today? And yes, there may be things you need to change, but as again, a lovely BIOS phrase is honor and alter. Honor the things that have gone before, you know, unless there was malfeasance or something was horrible, you don't need to honor that. But all the work, you don't suddenly want people who've been a working life doing one thing which the organization respected, and on the Friday and then the Monday you go, nah, that's all boring now, you need to be agile and flourishing and all of these things. So I think that's the other thing is, I think modern leadership is that relentless focus on, am I creating the conditions in which everybody in my organization is in flow, exercising their judgment in line with purpose and strategy. And I should spend as much time caring about that as this strategy, that strategy, all the things they think they pay me the big bucks for. So I think we need to stop seeing the hero leader and think about the servant leader, the servant of the organization. The person, what she does is she spends, as I say, as much time in understanding that there's so many people at work in her organization. How am I making sure that the work they do is as effective as it could be? And how do I understand that? Now, I think that's a modern form of leadership, as opposed to the rough, tough, you know, I'm the boss, I'm in charge, every decision, every micromanagement. And if you have to do some delegation and some letting go, some trusting, how do you trust to people's judgment? And I think that's a fascinating, so understand people better, care deeply about the conditions. Let's take one example, the Wells Fargo banking crisis, when some 4,000 odd people were fired for all sorts of malfeasance, selling financial instruments to people that didn't need them, didn't want them. If you or I were to imagine the job interview of every single one of those people who ended up being fired, being asked, why do you want to come and work at Wells Fargo? Here's what you and I could guarantee. Not one of them said, since I was 12, it's been my passion to sell financial services to retired people that they really don't need. It's been my passion to put ordinary people under financial burdens which they didn't need to be under. Why wouldn't I want to come and work at Wells Fargo? Nobody said that. So board, leadership, how did you systematically create and allow the conditions in which you turned 4,500 relatively ordinary people into crooks? Don't be that leader, don't be that board, and get over yourself in terms of believing that you are the fount of all wisdom. You're not. So what do you do to create those conditions in which the collective intelligence of the organization is really humming?
I think that's a very, very, if I may say, a significant pointer, because somewhere through this crisis, the mind operates in the manner saying that we're always possibly looking for heroes outside. And I think that hero piece will have to move. And I like the phrase that you used, the servant leader, creating conditions for everyone to thrive and be their natural best and contribute. I think that would be a way forward. I know, Robbie, we can carry on with these conversations for long, and there are some very interesting points that you touched, but I'm mindful of the time that we have. But I'd like to thank you for taking out the time and joining us on Conversations. I'm sure our listeners would be immensely pleased with the insights around AI, its implications for board, governance, etc. And they will find this really, really valuable and enjoyable. So thanks a lot for joining us today. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed this particular session of Conversations with Robbie. Till the time we meet again, goodbye, stay safe,